The first thing Sarah noticed was the silence where the forest used to breathe. She had grown up walking these trails above the settlement. The wide canopy shade of old-growth pines, the soft percussion of wind through pine needles. The underground murmur she had spent 11 years, learning to hear not with her ears but with the soles of her feet. Since childhood, she had known that the soil beneath these woods was alive, in a way that no textbook had ever adequately explained to her. Grandmother had been the one to press the child's palms flat against the dirt and say, "Listen, not with your ears, shh, with your chest." With your wanting, and Sarah had listened, and she had grown into a woman who understood the forest the way other people understood the grammar of their native language. Instinctively, in the marrow. So when the silence came, she felt it before she heard it. She was on the northern ridge, 30 meters above the settlement's outer fence, checking a grid of buried sensor probes she had planted 6 weeks earlier to track the mycelium network's nitrogen uptake rates. It was just past dawn. The mist sat in layers between the tree trunks, like pages of a book no one had finished reading. She pulled the data cable from probe 7 and plugged it into the reader on her forearm, and the numbers were climbing in a direction she had never anticipated. And then she straightened up and realized she had not heard a bird in 12 minutes. She stood very still. The silence was not natural. It had a texture to it, a density, like the air before a thunderstorm, except there were no clouds. She pressed her palm to the nearest pine trunk and felt nothing back. Not the nothing of dead wood, a different nothing, a listening nothing. She pulled her hand away and looked at it. Her palm was faintly warm. She reached for the radio clipped to her belt and keyed it twice. The code for, "I am coming in, nothing urgent. Do not open the outer gate until I signal." The settlement's comms officer, a young man named Devi, whose actual name she had long stopped trying to pronounce, returned 2 clicks. She gathered her equipment, took a slow look at the canopy above, noted the precise angle of morning light across the moss-covered stones near probe 7, and walked back down the ridge at a measured pace. It was important not to run. It was important. She, in 34 years of fieldwork, on 6 different planetary biomes, not to give whatever was watching the impression that you had noticed it. The settlement of Harrow Bend had been established 14 years ago on a world called Tesseract Bafoif in the colonial survey records, and called, by the 412 people who lived and worked and raised children there, simply the Green World. Was a temperate planet, biocompatible with human metabolism to an unusual degree, which the xenobiologists in the survey fleet had found exciting, and which the settlers had found merely practical. The soil grew food, the air was breathable, the water ran clean. What more did you need? More, Sarah had tried to explain at 3 successive colonial planning meetings, was an understanding of what was already here before you arrived. Because something was already here, not sentient in any form the colonists' definition of the word could accommodate. No cities, no tools, no organized social behavior that human eyes could detect, but alive in a way that defied every taxonomic framework Sarah had. The mycelium. It was everywhere, not just in the forest soil where you would expect to find it. Here, in the rock formations along the river. In the mineral substrate 20 meters below the surface, in places where nothing should have been able to survive. It formed networks of staggering complexity and staggering age. The oldest continuous filament she had dated was 11,000 years old and still metabolically active. She had submitted 5 papers in 4 years, each escalating in urgency, each politely received and subsequently filed under promising but preliminary by the colonial oversight body. They had settlements to run, crop yields to optimize, infrastructure to maintain. The mycelium was just mold, wasn't it? Just background ecology? Didn't it help the crops, actually? Hadn't Sarah herself shown that the agricultural fiends benefited from mycorrhizal associations with the network? So, what was the problem? Problem, Sarah would have said, if anyone had listened carefully enough, is that a system 11,000 years old doesn't form relationships with your crop roots because it's helpful. It forms relationships because that's how it eats. She had not said that at the planning meetings, because she did not yet have the data to prove it, and because in 14 years on the Green World she had learned, slowly, and at some cost, the difference between a theory and a weapon, and she was not willing to use one until it was the other. Now, walking down the ridge in the bird-silent morning, the sensor data still warm on her forearm reader, she thought, "You waited too long." She found Counselor Phelan in the administration building, which occupied a converted growing dome at the settlement center. He was eating breakfast at his desk, a bowl of cultivated grain she recognized as a strain her own research had helped develop. And he looked up at her with the expression of a man who has dealt with Sarah enough times to know that the absence of small talk means something has gone wrong. "Tell me," he said. She set her forearm reader on the desk and turned it so he could see the nitrogen uptake graphs, the lines spiking in the northern grid. Not the slow, seasonal variation she had been tracking for 3 years. Something sharp and purposeful, the kind of surge she associated with rapid mycelial expansion. With aggressive colonization of new substrate. "This started overnight," she said. Phelan studied the graph. He was 52, broad-shouldered, patient, in the way that only people who have survived genuine hardship tend to be patient. He had been a cargo hauler before the colonial program recruited him, and he had never pretended to understand Sarah's work, except in its most practical applications. And she respected him enormously for that clarity about his own limits. "What does it mean?" he said. "It means the network is doing something it has not done in the 3 years I've been monitoring it. The rate of change is orders of magnitude above anything in my baseline." She pulled up a second window on the reader. "I also want you to look at these signal propagation maps. The network has been transmitting electrochemical signals for as long as had sensors in the ground. But the pattern was diffuse, random or random seeming. As of last night, the pattern has changed." He looked at the second window. The signal map had been, for 3 years, a soft scatter of blue dots indicating low-amplitude electrochemical activity distributed evenly across the sensor grid. Now the dots had organized. They formed a shape Sarah had stared at for 2 hours before walking up the ridge. A shape she did not want to name, because naming it would make it real.
"Looks like a feeling started."
"It looks like a boundary," Sarah said. "It looks like the network is drawing a line around us." He set the reader down. Outside the dome's curved wall, the settlement was waking up. The distant sound of equipment starting, children's voices, the smell of someone's breakfast fire. All of it impossibly fragile and impossibly ordinary. "What do you need?" Phelan said. "Pull every sensor I have in the ground and redeploy them at 10-meter intervals along the outer fence line. Get me access to the Agricultural Department's soil monitoring arrays. And I need 3 volunteers who aren't afraid of the forest at night." "Why night?" "Because whatever this is," Sarah said, "it's being careful about the daylight hours. And careful things can be studied." She had 3 volunteers by noon. Their names were Cody, Preethi, and an older man named Voss, who had been part of the original surveying team and who did not explain his reasons for volunteering and did not need to. Cody was 23 and wanted to prove something. Preethi was 30 and methodical, and had worked 3 field seasons with Sarah before. Voss was 61 and carried a flask of something, amber, that he offered around without ever explaining what it was. And Sarah thought, watching them prepare their gear in the equipment bay, that these were the 3 exactly right people for what she needed. She gave them each a sensor harness and a data relay, and told them what she told all her field teams. "Don't disturb what you're measuring. Don't break contact with radio, and if anything feels wrong, you trust the feeling first, and the data second." "Counts as wrong?" Cody asked. "You'll know," she said. She had said this to perhaps 60 people over her career, and every one of them had eventually told her she was right. They went out at 10 that night, the 4 of them. Through the settlement's north gate and up the ridge trail in single file, with their headlamps on low, and the sensor harnesses pulsing soft green where the relay signals confirmed transmission. The forest was still silent in a way that was beginning to feel less like absence and more like attention. The mist had settled lower since morning. It came to their knees. Sarah watched it move around their legs, and noted that it moved against the wind's direction, and filed that away. At the first sensor grid, she had them space out at 30-meter intervals while she pulled data from the probes. The numbers had kept climbing through the day. The nitrogen uptake was now running at 6 times the baseline average. It was the electrochemical data that held her. The signals running through the mycelial filaments were not random oscillations anymore. They had structure, periodicity. They were, she realized, studying the waveform display on her reader with both hands tight around the device so they wouldn't shake. Organized the way signals are organized when they carry information. She did not say this out loud. She marked the data, flagged it, and moved to the next probe station. It was at probe 1140 meters northeast of the others that Preethi said through the radio in a very steady voice. "Sarah, don't make any fast movements. Come look at this." She found Preethi standing at the base of a large pine, headlamp off, arm extended toward the tree's root system, where it broke the surface in thick cabled arcs. The mist around the tree's base was not mist. Sarah knew mist. This had the wrong color. A faint blue-white luminescence, and it was moving with purpose. Filaments of it reaching upward along the roots, contracting and expanding in a slow rhythm. Bioluminescent mycelium. She had documented it in 2 papers. It occurred during periods of metabolic stress, or during spore dispersal, or, and this was the part of the literature that had never satisfied her, during what the older taxonomy texts called communication events, which was a phrase xenobiologists had invented because they did not want to use the word they meant. She crouched by the root structure and held her breath and watched. The filaments were reaching toward each other from separate root nodes, and where they touched, the luminescence brightened. They separated, it dimmed, on and off, binary. "Get this on camera," she said quietly, "everything. Don't miss anything." "Already recording," Preethi said. Behind them in the forest, something changed. Sarah felt it as a pressure shift. Not sound, not movement, but a change in the quality of the silence around them, a focusing of it. And she stood up very slowly and turned. The forest was the same forest it had been a moment ago. The same trees, the same mist, the same darkness between the trunks. The mist at the edge of the light was thicker now, and it glowed, faintly, in a curtain of soft luminescence that stretched from ground to canopy and ran in both directions as far as she could see. They were surrounded, not by anything she could call a threat, by anything that had a shape or a sound or an intent she could read with the tools she had brought. Surrounded by something that had been here 11,000 years before any human being had set foot on this world. Something that had grown its own nervous system through every meter of soil on this continent. Something that was now very deliberately illuminating itself and organizing its signals and drawing a line in the electrochemical language of the very old and patient. And was looking at them. "Nobody move," Sarah said. "We are guests. We are going to behave like it." She reached into her vest and pulled out the device she had built in the settlement's fabrication lab 4 months ago, after the second anomalous reading, after the night she had lain awake running numbers until she arrived at a conclusion she had not wanted to arrive at. It was a small thing, barely larger than her palm, a sensor array modified to detect and record electrochemical signals in the mycelium's known frequency range, wired to a simple output display. She had built it as a detector. Standing here now, surrounded by light, she understood she had actually built a receiver. She pressed it flat against the root system, and the display came alive with waveforms. She stared at the waveforms. Throat tightened. "Voss," she said, "I need you to come here very carefully and look at this." Voss came and crouched beside her and looked at the display for a long time. He was old enough to have learned, somewhere along the way, not to say the first thing that occurred to him. He looked at the waveforms for perhaps 30 seconds before he said, quietly, "How long have they been talking?" "I don't know," Sarah said. "I don't know what they're saying." "Yes." Voss straightened up and offered the flask around, and Sarah took it this time, and the amber liquid burned in a way that felt honest and appropriate. "Do we run?" Cody asked, in a voice that was trying not to be afraid, and mostly succeeding. "No," Sarah said. "We stay exactly where we are. We keep recording everything, and we try to figure out what we did that started this." She looked at the luminescent curtains surrounding them, and thought about 11,000 years of unbroken growth, and the silence that had replaced birdsong, and the nitrogen numbers climbing through the night. Because something changed, not us, the network. Something changed in how it's operating, and I think it's trying to tell us what. They stayed on the ridge until 2 in the morning. The network held its light until just before they left, and then the luminescence faded gradually, not switching off but receding, the way dawn recedes into full day, a slow and orderly withdrawal. By the time they walked back through the settlement's north gate, the forest was dark again, and the mist moved naturally with the wind, and the sensor probes were transmitting steady baseline data as if nothing had occurred. Sarah had 4 hours of recording, and a display full of waveforms, and a conviction that had moved during those hours from suspicion to certainty to something for which she did not have a scientific word. A knowledge that sat in her chest where her grandmother had told her to listen. She did not sleep. She set up in the lab 3 monitors, the full sensor array feed, the recordings from all 4 harnesses, and she worked. By 4 in the morning, she had isolated the primary signal structure. By 6, she had identified what she was hesitantly calling lexical units, repeating waveform patterns that appeared in consistent sequential relationships. The way words appear in consistent sequential relationships within sentences. She counted 14 distinct patterns in the 4-hour recording. 14 units. Not enough to build a grammar. Not remotely enough to construct meaning. Enough? More than enough to confirm what the waveforms had been telling her, since she crouched at that root system, in the blue-white glow. This was language, not metaphorical language. Not the metaphorical language of the forest is communicating by cycling nutrients, or the mycelium communicates distress through chemical signals. The kind of statement you could publish in a journal without anyone accusing you of anthropomorphism. Actual language, structured, patterned, intentional. The network was 11,000 years old and had a language, and it had turned that language toward 4 human beings standing on a ridge, and none of the 4 of them had understood a word. Sarah sat back and looked at the ceiling of the lab and thought, not for the first time, about what her grandmother had meant by, listen with your wanting. What you want to hear is not always what's being said. Sometimes the wanting is the beginning of understanding. Sometimes you start by wanting and arrive at knowing. She had spent 11 years wanting to understand the mycelium, and she had arrived at the edge of knowing something enormous. And the thing she was most afraid of was not the enormity of it. It was the possibility that the network had been patient, had been drawing its lines, and brightening its fillets in, and running its signals in careful patterns for longer than she had been looking, and that its patience was not infinite. She pulled up the nitrogen uptake graphs and looked at the slope of the climb. Not infinite. Something was changing for the network, too. Something was pressing it toward action, in a way that 11,000 years of patience had not required. She thought about the mycelial filaments reaching for each other at the root nodes, the on and off of the bioluminescent pulses, the boundary being drawn around the settlement in electrochemical ink. They were not being threatened. She was almost sure of that. Threat had a grammar she recognized from working in dangerous environments, a directness and a repetition, and the network's signals had neither quality. Were being asked something. She didn't know what. She had 14 signal units, 4 hours of recording, 3 years of baseline data, and a lifetime of learning to listen with more than her ears. She started building a lexicon. It took 9 days. 9 days during which the network held its boundary, and the birds did not return to the northern ridge, and the nitrogen uptake stabilized at its elevated level, as if the network had reached a decision point and was waiting. 9 days during which the settlement went about its ordinary life. Crop cycles, maintenance schedules, children's lessons, council meetings, and Sarah moved through it like a woman underwater, present and not present, half her attention always on the data streaming into her monitors. She briefed Phelan on day 3 and day 6. He listened both times without interruption and asked, both times, the same question, what do you need? On day 3, she needed more sensor arrays. On day 6, she needed him to sit down with the council and prepare them for the possibility that the Colonial Survey documentation for Tesseract was going to require substantial revision. Specifically, the section that categorized the planet's biome as non-sentient ecosystem, no contact protocols required. He did not flinch at either request. On day 8, Preethi came into the lab at midnight with a coffee and sat down beside Sarah and looked at the monitor where the lexical unit database was growing. and said, "You're not going to be able to publish this in the normal way, are you?" "No," Sarah said, "because if I'm right, everything we've done here for 14 years is different than what we thought it was." Preeti was quiet for a moment. "Are you right?" Sarah looked at the lexical units. 14 had become 41 over the 9 days of a decade, as she had pulled patterns from the archived signal data, going back to her first year on the green world. She had built rudimentary syntax maps. She had identified what appeared to be temporal markers, units that preceded others in patterns consistent with tense, or something analogous to tense, something that distinguished between states of being. She had found patterns she was tentatively calling conditionals if-then structures. The grammar of negotiation. "Yes," she said. "I'm right." Preeti handed her the coffee. "Then what does it want?" "I think," Sarah said slowly, "I think it's trying to ask what we want." Preeti sat with that for a moment. "We never asked," she said finally. "No," Sarah said, "we never asked." On day 9, she went back to the ridge alone. She went in the early morning, not the night. Broad daylight, the sensor harness on her back, and the receiver device in her hand, and a small speaker unit she had modified to output in the mycelium's known frequency range. Not a transmitter she had any confidence in. Not a device she expected to produce comprehensible output on the other end. But her grandmother had never expected the forest to speak back in words either. You put your hands in the soil. You listened with your wanting. You trusted that on the other side of the wanting, something would respond. The forest was silent when she arrived at the northern grid. The mist sat at knee height. She found a flat outcropping of stone near probe 7, sat down on it, and placed the receiver against the root system of the nearest tree. The display came alive immediately with waveforms, stable, cycling, waiting. She opened the speaker unit's output interface and spent several minutes calibrating the frequency, matching it to the baseline signal range, eliminating static. Her hands were steady. She had stopped being afraid on day 6. Not because the fear had left her, but because it had transformed into something she could work with. A sharpness, a clarity. The sensation she always associated with standing at the edge of understanding something genuinely new. She pulled up the lexical unit that she had tentatively identified as a greeting form. A short rhythmic pattern that appeared at the beginning of signal sequences, consistently, across 6 years of archived data. She had heard it at the root node on the ridge, and she had found it in recordings going back to her first winter on the green world, appearing with metronomic regularity on days she had marked in her logs as high network activity, cause unknown, and then filed without follow-up. High network activity. She had been so busy measuring what the network was doing that she had never stopped to ask who it was talking to. She played the greeting pattern through the speaker. Low amplitude, 5 seconds, and then silence. The waveforms on the receiver display did not change. She waited. She thought about her grandmother's hands, about the weight of soil, about 11,000 years. She played the greeting pattern again. The waveforms shifted. It was subtle. A change in the cycling rate of the background signal. A brightening at one node of the display that was consistent with signal amplification. But it was there, and it was a response. And Sarah sat very still on the stone outcropping and breathed carefully and watched the display and felt something she could not name move through her chest. Not triumph, not relief, not the clean satisfaction of a confirmed hypothesis. Something older than any of those things. Recognition. She worked for 3 hours. The exchange was not a conversation by any definition that word had previously held for her. It was more like two instruments tuning to each other, call and response, signal and confirmation. A slow mutual calibration that she could not translate and did not try to translate and understood with increasing certainty was not about translation at all. The network did not want her to understand its language. It wanted to know if she was capable of listening. She was. She had been listening for 11 years. She had been listening since her grandmother pressed her palms into the soil and said, "With your wanting." She played every lexical unit she had identified, in every sequence combination she had constructed. Watching this response patterns for confirmation and correction, building not a vocabulary but a relationship. The way you build a relationship with any intelligence that has been patient and careful and very old. Slowly, with attention, without expectation of immediate return. At 2 hours and 40 minutes, something happened that she had not expected. The network initiated. Without her prompting, without her playing a signal first, the display erupted into a complex waveform pattern she had never seen in the archived data. Long, structured, repeating, with what she identified immediately as several of her lexical units embedded in a larger sequence she could not parse. She sat with her finger over the record button. Already recording, had been recording since she sat down, and she watched the pattern run through its full length, and then pause, and then run again. A statement, not a question. A statement being said twice to make sure she had it. She recorded everything. She walked back down the ridge in midday sun, the receiver warm in her hand, the recording playing in her earpiece on loop. By the time she reached the settlement gate, she had identified 7 of her lexical units in the sequence. By the time she reached the lab, she had a rough structural map. By the time she sat down at the monitor, she understood that whatever the network had said, it contained the conditional structures she had identified, the if-then grammar, and one of the units she had designated as a temporal marker was appearing 4 times in the sequence, more than any other single element. Time. The statement was about time. She worked through the night. By morning, she had what she was willing to call a translation. It was not precise. It could not be precise, because she had 41 lexical units and no context for most of them, and a grammar she had constructed from 9 days of pattern analysis, rather than years of immersive study. And she knew enough about linguistics to know that translation was never precision, was always approximation, was always a kind of faith, but she had the structure and the repeating elements and the temporal markers, and the conditional syntax, and what the structure assembled into when she held it together in her mind and read it the way her grandmother had taught her to read things. Not parsing, not dissecting, listening. Was this: we have been here longer than you have been. We will be here when you are not. What you do to the ground, you do to us. We have not chosen to end what grows between us. Have you? She presented it to the full council that afternoon. All 14 of them, sitting in the curved space of the admin dome, and Phelan beside her, at the front, with the expression of a man who has already decided what he thinks, and is waiting to see if the room agrees with him. She did not dress it up. She did not soften it, she said. There is a sentient organism in the soil beneath our feet, and it has been communicating with us since before we arrived, and we have been measuring it for 11 years without recognizing what it was, and it has now addressed us directly, and the address contains question, and the question deserves an answer. The room was silent for a long time. Then a woman named Burroughs, who ran the settlement's agricultural operations and whose crops had the highest yield ratings in the colony, said, "What kind of an answer does it want?" "I think," Sarah said, "it wants to know if we're going to be here the same way we've been here. Taking from the soil without acknowledgement, growing our crops through its networks, without understanding what the relationship costs it. Whether we're going to stay and keep doing what we've done, or whether we're going to change." "Change how?" Burroughs said. "I don't know yet. I don't think it wants us to leave. I think it wants us to listen." Sarah paused. She looked around the room, at the faces of people who had built their lives here, who had planted roots in soil they now understood differently, who had children running through a forest, whose silence had been a form of speech they hadn't learned to hear. "We came here and we started farming, and we called it our land because nothing told us otherwise, nothing with a face. Shh. Nothing that could come to a meeting and lodge a complaint, that fit the definition we brought with us from another planet." She looked at the waveform display behind her, the recording from the ridge playing on loop in its scrolling visual translation of the network's language. Something was already here. Something 11,000 years old, and it has been patient, and it has been watching, and it has finally spoken clearly enough that even we could hear it. Another silence. Shh. Longer this time. Then Voss, who had said almost nothing since the night on the ridge, said from the back of the room, "What do we say back?" "I don't know," Sarah said. "But I know how to listen, and I think learning to listen is the beginning of the answer." She spent the next 3 months on the ridge, every morning at dawn. She brought the speaker unit and the receiver, and she built the lexicon unit by unit, session by session, with the same patience she had always brought to the mycelium's data, and a new quality she was still trying to name. Something like reverence. Something like the feeling you have in a cathedral, except the cathedral was 11,000 years of root and filament and slow exchange. Something that had been grown rather than built. The network was, she came to understand, not a single intelligence, but a distributed one. More like a parliament than a mind, more like a community than an individual. The signals she received were not the thoughts of one entity, but the result of something she came to think of as consensus formation. The network processing her presence and her signals through its entire distributed structure before responding. This was why the responses were slow, not because the network was simple, because it was vast. She began to understand that it was not angry. It had never been angry. The boundary it had drawn, the elevated nitrogen uptake, the luminescent display on the ridge. These had not been threats. They had been calls to attention. They had been the mycelial equivalent of someone raising their hand in a meeting and saying, "I am here, and I have been waiting, and I would like to speak now if you're ready." They had been ready, just late. The agricultural protocols changed first, because Burroughs was practical, and because the network's early responses to Sarah's questions about soil use were specific and quantifiable in ways that agricultural engineers could work with. Reduced depth tilling in the northern and eastern fields, seasonal fallowing rotations timed to the network's own slope cycles, rather than to standard colonial farming calendars. Inoculation zones where the mycelial network was allowed to extend through the crop fields without interference, which turned out, unsurprisingly, to improve yields in a way that the colonial oversight body noted approvingly in their next quarterly report, without quite understanding why. The water management changed. The construction protocols changed. The settlement's children who had grown up running through a forest they had been told was safe background ecology began to come to Sarah's morning sessions on the ridge. They sat behind her at first, watching the receiver display light up with waveforms. Asking questions she tried to answer honestly. What is it saying? Does it want? Does it like us? She told them the truth, which was that she was still learning. That understanding a mind so different from your own was slow work and important work, and you had to do it without assumptions, without expecting the world to speak to you in your own language, without deciding in advance what it was allowed to mean. The children listened. They were good at it. Children were usually better than adults at listening to things they didn't understand, because they hadn't spent enough years yet deciding that things they didn't understand weren't worth their attention. Cody started spending time on the ridge, then Preethi, then gradually others. The settlement had a habit on the long summer evenings, when the work was done, of gathering at the outer fence line and watching the sun go down over the northern forest. Sarah had always found this comforting. The communal instinct of it, the simple human need to mark the end of a day together, changed slowly over the months of the ridge sessions. Was the quality of the watching. People stopped looking at the forest as scenery. They stood at the fence line, and they watched the way you watch something alive. Something that might acknowledge you back, if you were patient enough. One evening, a month before the second anniversary of the signal's appearance, a child named Osa, who was 7 years old, and had started sitting in on the morning sessions, 3 weeks prior grabbed Sarah's hand at the fence line and pointed at the root system of the nearest pine, which was just visible in the fading light, and said, "Look." The bioluminescence was there, soft, steady, not the intense curtain of that first night, but a gentle warmth moving through the root nodes, on and off, in a pattern Sarah recognized from the receiver display, the greeting form. Sarah crouched beside Osa and looked at it for a moment. The child's hand was small in hers, warm and alive. "What does it mean?" Osa asked. "It means hello," Sarah said. "Should we say hello back?" Sarah looked at the light in the root system, at the 11,000-year-old grammar of it, at the patience that had waited longer than human civilization for someone to sit down in the soil and listen. "We already did," she said. "That's what it's answering." The colonial survey documentation for Tesseract 4 was revised that year. Section 4.7, formerly titled Non-Sentient Ecosystem Overview. T was retitled First Contact Protocols. Mycelial Network Intelligence. And it was the first colonial document in the survey fleet's 40-year history to carry that designation for a non-animal organism. Sarah wrote the contact guidelines herself, 11 pages of methodology and ethics and linguistic framework, and she sent them with a cover note that said, "This is not finished. It will never be finished." That is the nature of a living conversation. The oversight body received it well. Better than she had expected, honestly. Few of the senior xenobiologists sent responses that contained phrases like paradigm shift and implications for the entire survey program, which she filed and did not read again because what the document was about was not paradigms and not programs but the specific, daily, unhurried work of learning to be a neighbor. Harrow, Bend became, over the years that followed, a different kind of settlement than it had been. Not a failed one, and not an abandoned one, and not the gleaming model of human colonial efficiency the oversight body had originally designated it. Something more complicated and more interesting. A place where the morning shift at the outer fence included a 5-minute check of the root node bioluminescence readings, where the agricultural calendar was built in consultation with the network's growth cycles, rather than imposed upon them. Children grew up understanding that the land they lived on was not land in the way the word land had previously meant. Not a substrate, not a resource, not a backdrop to human activity, but a neighbor. Old and patient and strange present. Sarah still went to the ridge at dawn. She had a better transmitter now. Purpose-built by the settlement's engineering team, with input from 3 xenolinguists she had brought in from the wider colony network. And the lexicon had grown to over 300 units, and the grammar was dense and specific, and still incomplete in ways she expected would take decades more to resolve. She sat on the flat stone near Probe 7, and she listened to the receiver display, and she tried to respond, carefully and honestly, in a language she had built from the ground up, in both senses of the phrase. The network was patient with her errors. It had always been patient with human errors. What it had not been until now was sure they were worth correcting. She crouched at the root system on a morning, in early autumn, the air sharp and clear, birdsong restored to the northern ridge. By some process she did not fully understand but associated with the settling of the relationship between the settlement and the network, the way stress responses in a living system resolve when the stressor is removed. She held the receiver flat against the root and watched the waveforms cycle. In the display's soft light she thought about what it meant to arrive somewhere and find it already inhabited. About the difference between a guest and a conqueror, which was not a difference of technology, or power, or even intention but of attention, whether you were willing to look at what was already there, and take the time to understand it before you decided what it meant. Humanity was very old at conquest, 11,000 years old at nothing. They had come to this world with every instrument for measuring and none for listening, and they had built and farmed and called it theirs. And they had been wrong about what it meant for something to be theirs. And they had been slow and stubborn about understanding the wrongness. And those were human qualities she recognized without flinching. The stubbornness, the slowness, the tendency to mistake your own urgency for universality. It was also a human quality. You could be told something. You could listen. You could change. The display brightened in the familiar opening pattern of a new signal sequence. The greeting form, then 3 units she had designated inquiry markers. Then a long structure whose translation she was still refining, a structure that appeared on mornings after long silences, in the same position in the signal stream, and that she had provisionally labeled continuation. The network's way of saying that the conversation was not finished, that it had more to say, that it was willing to wait for her to grow capable of hearing it. She pressed the transmitter button and played back the continuation unit, meaning, I am here. I am listening. I am trying. The waveform shifted. The root nodes brightened. In the distance, in the upper canopy, a bird called. The specific 2-note call she had learned to associate with the mornings, when the network's activity was high and settled, when it was operating in what she thought of as its contentment register, though she was careful not to use that word in publications. She used it here, alone on the ridge in the early light, because her grandmother had not taught her to be careful. Grandmother had taught her to listen, and listening was never careful. It was open. It was present. It was the willingness to have everything you thought you knew, turned over like soil. Turned over to see what was growing underneath, what had always been growing underneath, patient and strange, and alive, and waiting for you to finally look. She looked. The forest breathed. She breathed with it.